Live on Twitch every day from 3 to 7 p.m. ET. Link in bio.
In October 2025, Facepunch named the problem out loud: scrap inflation. Scrap was everywhere. Progression had grown stale, and the wipe was moving too fast and becoming too easy. For years before that diagnosis, one gray resource from barrels and boxes had paid for permanent blueprints, tiered workbenches, and the tech tree at once. How did a sweat equity loot drop become the currency that set the pace of every wipe? And why did Facepunch decide scrap alone should no longer unlock the full workbench ladder? Scrap arrived on the 4th of May, 2017, in Devblog 158. Destroy a barrel and you get 1 scrap. Loot boxes and you get 5 to 10, depending on the box. Helk framed it as a sweat equity resource. In his words, you'll know exactly how much effort each piece of scrap represents. The research table already let players work with components. Scrap became the new measurable medium on that table. You spent scrap to craft components, and each piece you added raised the chance of success. Success or failure destroyed all the scrap in the table. Reaching a guaranteed result took different scrap amounts depending on the component, and you needed at least one of the target component to start. Recycling components returned 10% of their scrap requirement as scrap, along with the usual recycle parts. Helk argued that scrap had measurable value, an intrinsic use for components, and broad accessibility. Those traits, he said, made it a good candidate for a common currency in the game. He hoped players would charge scrap at vending machines. The research table itself cost metal fragments, high-quality metal, and sheet metal to craft. The changelog was blunt. Scrap was added, scrap could create components at the research table, and components could recycle into scrap at a 10% yield. Components and research were already part of the game. Scrap was the resource Facepunch hoped would make effort legible and tradable. Within months, that hope would harden into something much larger than a research table gamble. On the 5th of October 2017, Devblog 180 shipped the first iteration of Blueprint's Return. Helk said the team and players were unhappy with how easy it was to get top-end gear, and with how little reason there was to stick around after you were killed. Blueprints 3.0 was the answer they shipped. Players started with default blueprints: campfires, furnaces, workbenches, storage, and the rest, about 50 defaults. Loot could drop full weapons and tools at low condition, useful as research sources. To permanently learn an item, you took it to a research bench and paid scrap for a blueprint. Helk was clear about the rule change. In his words, the cost of doing so is scrap. There isn't any percent chance of success, of fail, or anything like that anymore. Just a straight-up cost to research. Researched blueprints could be studied for permanent craft knowledge or traded. Workbenches shipped in 3 tiers that required significant amounts of scrap to produce, and each tier required the previous one. You had to go 1 to 2 to 3. No skipping ahead. Standing near a placed workbench activated a HUD status so you could craft that tier and below, and craft faster when the bench outranked the item. Components still required scrap to produce, the same scrap amounts they had needed at the old research tables, and they also required a Tier 3 workbench. Helk cut high-quality metal from components by about 75 to 80%. Items could only be repaired if you had their blueprint, with exceptions for items you could not know. In a few months, scrap had gone from component gamble to the guaranteed cost of permanent blueprints and the sequential ladder of workbenches. Every wipe's early game now ran through how fast a group could farm scrap, spend it, and climb that ladder. A month later, on the 9th of November 2017, Devblog 185 added Workbench experimentation. Using a workbench opened an experiment UI. You spent scrap to produce a random blueprint relevant to that workbench tier. The system checked what you had already learned, so duplicates only happened if you failed to study the blueprint you just produced. Helk described 2 paths: finding random gear in the world and researching it as a shortcut, or a slower, longer, but more certain progression if you kept dumping resources into the workbench. Exact scrap costs per experiment were not published in that post. The system itself was clear enough. Scrap bought random unknown blueprints at the bench. That random path lasted for years. Then, on the 3rd of December 2020, Facepunch replaced Workbench experimentation with per-tier tech trees. The official post explained why. Workbench experimenting had let players use scrap for a random unknown blueprint. Since then, nearly an extra 130 items had been added, which made random experimenting both costly and frustrating. Say goodbye to experimentation and say hello to tech trees. Each workbench level got its own tech tree of items for that tech level. Unlocks were linear and path based. You specialized along a tree instead of rolling the same RNG. Research table research of found world items stayed in place. You could still find gear and research it as normal. Balance was expected to iterate, and a January patch was noted as a mandatory blueprint wipe across servers. The same era of rebalance removed blueprint drops from barrels and crates. Scrap also showed up as a multi system currency in the same post. Safe zone vehicle prices listed in scrap, including a saddle at 75 scrap, a boat at 125, and a RHIB at 300. By the end of 2020, scrap was no longer only a research table risk or a one-shot BP cost. It was the planned fuel of the tech tree. The path groups farmed every wipe to unlock craft power tier by tier. Years of scrap abundance and scrap sinks that no longer fully gated pace set up the mid-story correction. On the 2nd of May, 2024, Meta Madness applied a tax rate to Tier 2 and Tier 3 workbench tech trees. Facepunch said it would increase the cost of unlocking items, starting at 10% for Tier 2 and 20% for Tier 3. That cost increase applied only to unlocking via the tech tree. Researching items at the research table was unchanged. The rationale was that the tech tree progression path had become a little stale and needed to be shaken up, while still keeping deterministic unlocks instead of pure RNG. The same update split recycler yields by location. Safe zone recyclers yielded 80% of what they used to, with cycle time increased to 8 seconds. Monument recyclers yielded 120% at the prior cycle speed. Facepunch was pricing safety against risk for recycle-based scrap farming. They were already treating tech tree scrap spending and easy recycle scrap as problems. They had not yet used the phrase scrap inflation. On the 2nd of October, 2025, Metashift put the diagnosis in plain language. Alistair wrote that the current progression meta had grown stale, moving too fast and becoming too easy over the years, with scrap inflation and scrap being everywhere. Facepunch did not call that overwhelmingly negative. They said it had detracted from world PvP, especially in and around monuments, and that they wanted to experiment more with progression. This was experimental step 1. The aim was to get players back out of their bases, contesting monuments, slow down progression, and clash over territory. Workbench level 1 stayed the same. Level 2 required 5 basic blueprint fragments. Level 3 required 5 advanced blueprint fragments. Basic fragments always spawn in green puzzle rooms, one at a time, always in blue card puzzles next to the red key card, two at a time, and they appear at medium and large monuments, in airdrops, and with chances in military crates, large underwater crates, junk pile scientists, and roadside metal detecting. Advanced fragments are guaranteed in hackable crates, with a 1 in 10 chance in elite crates, always in pairs, and main finds at launch site, military tunnels, nuclear missile silo, underwater labs, both oil rigs, cargo ship, and the Chinook crate. 20 basic fragments convert to 1 advanced. Facepunch also said scrap crafting costs for workbench levels 2 and 3 were now greatly reduced, so players would have extra scrap to unlock items from the tech tree. Rustified's patch summary reported the new craft costs as Tier 2 at 5 basic fragments plus 250 scrap, down from 500 scrap, and Tier 3 at 5 advanced fragments plus 500 scrap, down from 1250. Fragments were required for crafting the benches, not for repairing them. Facepunch's own Metashift post did not print those pre-patch integers. The greatly reduced line is official, and the exact before and after scrap numbers are Rustified's reporting. Larger groups, Facepunch said, may trade surplus fragments. Smaller groups and solos will be forced to scrap harder for their progression, making monuments hotly contested again. That is how Facepunch described the design expectation. Some players still prefer the old pace. Farm scrap, dump it into benches and trees, unlock fast. Facepunch's stated position is monument contest and a slower early wipe. The studio said it would adjust and balance as needed, with further work planned for the December update. Scrap still runs unlocks. You still farm barrels and boxes, still feed the recycler, still buy your way through the tech tree. What meta shift changed is the workbench ladder itself. Scrap alone no longer equals full progression. Fragments, Softgate, Tier 2, and Tier 3. Leftover scrap is meant to go back into the tree. One gray resource still sets much of the wipe's economy. It is no longer the only key to the throne, and Facepunch framed that shift as an experiment they would keep balancing.
Live on Twitch every day from 3 to 7 p.m. ET. Link in bio.